So one of the things that we want to cover in our analysis before we do an Office 365 migration is we want to do a content inventory list. So here's an example of what one of those might look like and the types of information that you'd want to gather in that. So the first thing you want to do is you want to identify just who it's with. Is it with a department? Is it with a company? How do you identify these folks in your organization? And then make sure that you know who the business owners are. So that's going to possibly change for each solution inside the department. So as you can see, something in IT, we might have multiple owners across multiple solutions. So the very first thing that you want to do is just identify what is the content that you actually have, where is it, or who owns it, where is it, and then if there's whatever the name of the solution is. So for example, you're probably not going to go through and do every single individual library in this initial first pass of the content inventory list. So for example, if we're looking at file shares, you might be as non-specific as a drive letter, for example, like a shared drive. Probably not, though. You're probably going to have to go one layer deep inside of a shared drive just to identify, for example, if these things are not going to live on the file share and you want them to live someplace else, like in OneDrive for Business, then we need to be able to make that connection between the fact that we don't really have an owner for it now in a file share, potentially, right? But now we're going to have to assign an owner. So this is just the first step, and you can take this at just a real high level. If it's a file share, you want to make sure that you understand probably that one layer deep underneath the drive level, who the owner is for each of those libraries. And then we'll talk later about what that migration plan is going to be. That might be a little premature at this point. So right now, all you're doing with your content inventory list is you're just saying, hey, this is the scope of the project. This is everything we're agreeing to move. And that's not just going to be with file shares. That's the example that I'm using. It's going to be also other SharePoint sites, for example. So let's say that, you've got information on a SharePoint site. This one might be easier, right? Because if you have an HR site, pretty clearly it's going to go over to HR. The migration plan is going to decide whether or not it's going to go to the SharePoint site or whether it's going to become part of the Teams content. So again, don't worry about where it's going to go right now. That comes later. All you're doing right now is getting a good handle on what's coming over. Look at my graphic, though, in the upper right-hand corner, because you'll want to pay attention to this piece. We're not doing a lift and shift, right? We're not just saying, okay, every single thing in a file share is now going to go over to SharePoint. That doesn't make any sense. There's lots of information in a file share that doesn't need to come over into the new environment. So what you're doing is you're going through and you're doing that initial analysis of content to decide, hey, what's just going to retire where it's at, for example, or if you're going completely off-prem, then understand what's going into an archive, right? So what's going into retirement from a content perspective, what's being deleted altogether, and then what you're going to migrate of the existing. So we're only dealing with that middle section here, that migrate existing, so that way you can say, okay, we're going to decide later where everything's going to go in the environment, but this is what we've decided we are migrating. So it's probably going to turn into two lists. You're going to have a retirement list and a migration list so that people are very clear about what's in scope and what's out of scope in the project. As part of your analysis for your Office 365 migration, you're going to want to put together what I call a workflow checklist. And what this is doing is this is actually taking any kind of workflow that exists, whether or not it's automated. So pay really close attention to what I just said there. This is looking at any of your forms that you have out there. So even if it's a paper form or it's a paper system, I want it inside of this workflow checklist. It's going to be important. And that's going to seem like a really daunting task. So don't worry about the amount of it yet. We'll scope it later. All we're doing right now is getting a real clear understanding of what actually exists in the organization. Typically, how we do this is we go probably department by department, or we look at a work stream, or we look at like a business process, and we say, okay, within this business process, how are documents created, or how are requests created, who creates them, and then who edits them, who approves them, and then who actually implements them, for example, right? So that's typical workflow, an approval workflow that then turns into a task list. So what you're doing is you're looking at obviously anything that's already automated, okay? But you're also looking for opportunities with those paper forms. We're not trying to improve anybody's process at this point beyond if they consider automation improving it, but they may not even sign off on the fact that we're going to automate it. But we can't even build a proof of concept unless we know it exists. So typically think about something like, I don't know, an expense report or an approval of vacation, right? You may have other systems that do these, but just go with me on this idea, that whatever you have, it could be task lists. So these are other things that I would look for inside of SharePoint. Find your task lists, find your issues lists. Really do a good job of navigating those libraries. If you have forms libraries, then obviously that's going to be, something that we'll want to have inside of this checklist. And all we're doing again is we're just putting together a list of them. We're not making any decisions right now about where they're going or what they're doing. So we just need to know what's the list, where it's at. Is it on paper? Is it on a SharePoint site, for example? Is it in another system, right? Is it in our ERP system? Is it in SAP? Is it in Dynamics? Is it sitting someplace else? Just again, so that we have a complete understanding of our current state. Who owns that? Who supports it? That's important as well. Is this something that the IT help desk supports? Is this something that they have internal folks that support? Do they have a contractor that supports this? So make sure that you're identifying that as well. And then this is where you're going to choose your proof of concepts from. So at that point, you're going to want to capture when you actually demonstrated for them what the new functionality inside of Office 365 is going to be with regards to this particular workflow. And then a target date to either deliver the new workflow or some sort of a checklist that just says, listen, we saw this, we identified it, and we decided that we're not going to migrate it, right? So there may be lots of stuff out there that you're not going to migrate, but that's the only decision you're making at this point. You're not deciding where it's going to go. You're not deciding what it's going to look like. All you're deciding is whether or not you're going to migrate it. And if you are going to migrate it, when you have demonstrated whatever the new functionality would be for these folks, just so that they're aware of a change that's coming. So this is really good change management 101, to take all of these workflows, take all of these processes, look for Visio diagrams as well. Any place where somebody's written a Visio diagram is probably a good indication that there is some sort of a process or a workflow involved. So look at your standards, look at your procedures, look at your workflows, look at your forms, do searches for these types of file types inside of your environment, as well as just ask the business. When you do that initial analysis with the business, you're going to ask them what are their processes that they rely on day in and day out to manage their business. Always use words like approval, right? Who approves things? Anything that has to be approved is 100% going to be a potential for a new workflow in Office 365. All right, so inside of your Office 365 analysis, that part of the project, you're gonna have to do a permissions matrix. And the reason why this is so important is because inside of Office 365, as you probably already know, when you create an Office 365 group, you're actually creating, at a minimum, you're creating a SharePoint site, and then you have the option to create a team. So in my experience, it's better to develop your team's architecture based on your Office 365 groups. And so this is where you 100% have to start. So before you get too deep into any design, make sure that you've done a permissions matrix. And so what that's going to look like is it's going to look like what department are they in addition to what business process they're in, the names of the people who are in that, and then what their role is or what their permission level is for that content. So that's a lot. So just look at that only piece of information I've given you on this slide, that you are defining your groups, right? Your Office 365 groups based on the permission level that the users share. And if you weren't doing that with your AD groups, then that's why you have to do this analysis. If you'd already gone through and done it this way with your Active Directory groups, then all you have to do is list out your Active Directory groups and list out whether or not you've mapped them to Office 365. But in my experience, Active Directory probably needs a little bit of cleanup before we can actually migrate to Office 365. But ultimately, that's what you're going for. You're going for what I would say, clean up the Active Directory groups so that way you can just do a straight migration into Azure. So look at your Active Directory groups, create new Active Directory groups, all based on the permission level that people are going to share inside of a business process or inside of a department. In this video, we covered the 3 things that I recommend that you do inside the analysis phase of your project. We talked about doing a content inventory list. We talked about doing a workflow checklist. And then we finished up by talking about doing a permissions matrix. If you have any questions, please contact me on Twitter at OfficeOverEasy. And always use the hashtag when you're quoting me, migrations are my jam. Thanks for joining us.